"Sir, don't drink that coffee." The whisper was so soft it barely rose above the quiet hum of the executive conference room. Yet somehow it cut through the polished silence more sharply than any alarm ever could. Richard Harrison paused with the porcelain cup less than an inch from his lips. Around the 40-foot walnut conference table, 12 senior executives froze in confusion before slowly turning toward the source of the interruption. Standing beside the service cart, still wearing a neatly pressed housekeeping uniform with a small silver name tag that read Maya Williams, the black maid lowered her eyes for only a heartbeat before looking directly back at the billionaire CEO. No one in that room had ever heard her speak before. She wasn't supposed to. She was one of those invisible employees everyone passed without noticing. The person who quietly replaced empty water glasses, polished fingerprints from glass walls, and disappeared before anyone important arrived. A stunned silence settled over the room like heavy winter snow. Then someone laughed. It wasn't a nervous laugh. It was the dismissive chuckle of a man who believed he already understood exactly where everyone belonged. Ethan Brooks leaned back in his leather chair, straightened the cuff of his expensive navy suit, and smiled with quiet amusement. "Richard," he said calmly, "I think housekeeping is getting a little too comfortable." Several executives exchanged uncomfortable smiles. One woman glanced toward the security officer standing beside the conference room doors. Another executive looked down at his tablet, pretending not to notice the awkward interruption. Maya didn't move. Her hands remained folded in front of her apron, but every instinct inside her told her to run. She knew she had already crossed a line that could cost her the only steady job she'd managed to keep in almost 3 years. She had promised herself she would stay invisible when Harrison Global hired her 6 months earlier. Keep your head down. Do your work. Go home. Those simple rules had kept food on her grandmother's table and the lights on inside their small Charlotte apartment. Breaking those rules meant risking everything. Richard Harrison slowly lowered the coffee cup without taking a sip. His steel-gray eyes studied Maya with the measured caution of a man who had spent decades building an empire by trusting evidence instead of emotion. "Why?" he asked quietly. The room somehow became even stiller. Maya swallowed once. "Because that isn't the coffee your assistant ordered 5 minutes ago, sir." A faint crease appeared across Richard's forehead. Ethan's smile faded almost imperceptibly. "Excuse me?" Richard asked. Maya took one careful breath. "Someone replaced your cup after it left the executive kitchen." Before another word could be spoken, every light inside the 43rd floor conference center flashed bright white. A sharp electronic tone echoed through the ceiling speakers. Then a calm computerized voice filled the room. "Attention! Security lockdown initiated. All executive floors are now sealed. Please remain where you are until further notice." Heavy magnetic locks engaged with a series of metallic clicks throughout the hallway outside. The conference room doors locked automatically. Several executives stood so abruptly their chairs rolled backward across the polished hardwood floor. One reached immediately for his phone, only to discover there was no signal. Richard Harrison looked from the sealed doors back to Maya Williams. For the first time since she had begun working inside Harrison Global, the most powerful man in the building wasn't looking through her as though she were invisible. He was looking directly at her. Maya Williams had learned long ago that the easiest way to survive was to become someone people forgot 5 seconds after walking past her. Every weekday morning she arrived at Harrison Global before 6 o'clock, entered through the employee service entrance beneath the towering glass headquarters in downtown Charlotte, tied back her dark curls beneath a simple housekeeping cap, clipped on her name badge, and quietly pushed the same gray cleaning cart through hallways lined with framed awards worth more than the apartment where she lived with her grandmother. Most executives never noticed the polished marble floors beneath their shoes, the spotless conference tables waiting before every meeting, or the fresh coffee that somehow always appeared exactly when they expected it. Maya noticed everything because it was her job to. She knew which elevators squeaked, which office doors never fully latched, and which executives thanked the staff with a smile instead of a nod. She also knew something far more valuable than schedules or floor plans. She paid attention when everyone else was too busy feeling important. Her grandmother used to tell her that kindness could open doors, but careful observation could keep those doors from closing forever. Those words stayed with Maya after her mother passed away from a long illness. leaving her grandmother to raise her with little money but endless dignity. College had once seemed possible. Maya had earned excellent grades in chemistry and biology during high school, fascinated by how tiny details often explained enormous mysteries. Life, however, had different plans. Medical bills replaced tuition savings, and after graduation, she accepted the first full-time job she could find. She never complained. Honest work was still honest work, yet she never stopped learning. Every evening after finishing her shift, she borrowed books from the public library, watched free online lectures, and read articles about food safety, workplace procedures, and chemical hazards simply because understanding the world made it feel a little less unpredictable. Those quiet habits changed the way she looked at ordinary things. A strange smell, a misplaced folder, a coffee cup sitting where it did not belong. While others dismissed small details, Maya instinctively connected them like pieces of a puzzle. Earlier that same morning, she had entered the executive pantry to refill cream pitchers before the quarterly board meeting. The catering order listed 12 ceramic cups and one white porcelain cup reserved exclusively for Richard Harrison because he preferred a lighter roast than everyone else. She remembered placing that cup on a silver tray herself before stepping into the hallway to retrieve fresh linen napkins. When she returned less than a minute later, everything appeared normal, except for one detail that refused to leave her mind. Richard's porcelain cup was now resting slightly farther from the tray handle, turned several inches clockwise, and the faint aroma drifting upward was different from the mild caramel blend she had poured only moments earlier. It carried a subtle bitter scent that did not belong in that particular roast. Maya looked around the pantry. No one was there. She almost convinced herself she was imagining it. After all, she was only the maid. Nobody expected someone in her position to question anything happening inside the executive floor. But as she wheeled her cart toward the conference room, that uneasy feeling grew heavier with every step until remaining silent felt more dangerous than speaking at all. Now, standing inside the locked boardroom with every executive staring at her, Maya realized there was no turning back. Whether anyone believed her or not, the invisible woman had finally been seen. The electronic locks remained engaged with an unbroken red light, glowing above the conference room doors, transforming one of the most exclusive boardrooms in Charlotte into a place where titles suddenly meant very little. Richard Harrison remained standing at the head of the polished table, one hand resting lightly beside the untouched coffee cup, while his sharp gray eyes moved from face to face with deliberate patience. At 61, he had spent more than 3 decades building Harrison Global from a regional logistics company into one of the nation's most respected transportation and infrastructure corporations. Newspapers often described him as disciplined, brilliant, and impossible to surprise. Employees described him differently. They called him distant. Fair, perhaps, but emotionally unreachable. Richard believed every problem could be solved with data, procedures, and accountability. Trust was earned through results, not promises, and certainly not through emotion. That philosophy had made him extraordinarily successful, but it had also created a workplace where everyone carefully protected their position. Around the conference table sat executives whose annual bonuses exceeded the lifetime earnings of many. Hourly employees working downstairs. Each tailored suit, polished watch, and leather portfolio represented years of ambition and competition. They were accustomed to making decisions that affected thousands of workers without ever speaking to most of them. The appearance of a housekeeper in the middle of a board meeting challenged more than protocol. It challenged the invisible hierarchy everyone accepted without question. Ethan Brooks quietly broke the silence first. His voice remained calm, but beneath that calm rested the confidence of a man who had climbed the corporate ladder by controlling every conversation he entered. As executive director of strategic operations, Ethan had spent 11 years becoming Richard Harrison's most trusted advisor. He anticipated meetings before they happened, remembered every important birthday, and always seemed to have the perfect answer before anyone else finished asking the question. To the board, Ethan represented competence and stability. To employees outside the executive floor, he represented something colder. Housekeeping staff knew him as the executive who never acknowledged greetings. Administrative assistants knew him as the manager who corrected tiny mistakes in front of entire teams. Security officers recognized the impatient look that appeared whenever anyone delayed his schedule by even a minute. Ethan glanced toward Maya with the faint smile of someone watching an inconvenience instead of a person. "Richard," he said evenly, "we have investors joining by video in less than 15 minutes. Security is obviously responding to a false alarm somewhere in the building. I recommend we allow them to handle their job while we continue handling ours." Several executives nodded almost automatically. Returning to normal felt easier than questioning why normal had suddenly disappeared. Richard did not answer immediately. Instead, he reached for the printed meeting agenda lying before him. His eyes stopped on the handwritten initials confirming the executive breakfast delivery. Ethan had signed for it himself less than 20 minutes earlier. Richard slowly looked back toward the untouched porcelain cup, then toward Maya. She remained exactly where she had been, neither pleading nor defending herself. She simply waited. That quiet confidence unsettled him more than panic would have. Most people facing a room full of powerful executives searched desperately for approval. Maya searched for nothing. She looked like someone carrying a truth that did not depend on whether anyone believed it. Outside the reinforced glass walls, distant footsteps echoed through the executive hallway before fading into silence. Somewhere beyond the locked doors, radios crackled with urgent voices too muffled to understand. Inside the boardroom, every second stretched longer than the one before. Richard finally spoke, his voice steady enough to quiet every whispered conversation around the table. "Until I know exactly why this floor has been locked down," he said, never taking his eyes off Maya Williams. "This meeting is no longer about quarterly earnings. It is about finding out who changed that coffee cup and why." No one reached for a chair after Richard Harrison finished speaking. The polished boardroom that usually echoed with confident presentations now held only the quiet ticking of the antique wall clock and the faint vibration of security radios somewhere beyond the sealed doors. Maya could feel every pair of eyes fixed on her, measuring her uniform before considering her words. She understood that look. It was the same one she had seen in grocery stores when customers assumed she worked there simply because of the color of her skin, the same silent judgment that decided who belonged in the room before anyone spoke. Richard folded his hands together. "Miss Williams," he said evenly, "start from the beginning. Tell me exactly what you saw. Do not leave out a single detail." Maya nodded once. Her voice remained calm despite the pressure pressing against her chest. "At 9:23 this morning, I prepared the executive coffee service. Your porcelain cup was placed on the silver tray closest to the pantry entrance. I stepped into the linen closet for less than 1 minute because the napkins delivered this morning were missing." Ethan Brooks gave a dismissive sigh loud enough for everyone to hear. "This is becoming ridiculous." Richard raised one finger without looking at him. Ethan immediately fell silent. Maya continued. "When I returned, the tray looked almost identical. Almost." One of the board members leaned forward. "Almost." Maya nodded. "The handle of your cup was facing a different direction. It had also been moved several inches from where I left it. Most people would never notice something that small." Ethan smiled again, this time with open disbelief. "You expect us to believe you memorized the exact position of a coffee cup?" Maya met his eyes without anger. "No, sir. I memorized the entire tray because I polished it myself. Every spoon, every sugar packet, every napkin was placed deliberately." The room grew quiet again. Richard listened without interrupting. Maya slowly looked toward the untouched cup, still resting near his seat. "Then I noticed something else. The aroma had changed." A few executives exchanged puzzled glances. "Coffee smells like coffee," one of them muttered under his breath. Maya gently shook her head. "Not always. Mr. Harrison drinks a light caramel roast every morning. I refill the executive pantry every weekday. This cup smelled sharper, slightly bitter, not strong enough for most people to notice, but different enough that I could not ignore it." Ethan folded his arms. "Or perhaps someone brewed a different batch." Maya answered immediately. The coffee maker was still warming the second pot. No other batch had been prepared yet. That answer lingered in the air. Even Richard seemed surprised by how quickly she responded. She was not guessing. She knew the routine because she lived it every day while everyone else walked past without looking. Suddenly, the conference room speaker emitted a short electronic tone. "Chief Ross requesting access to Executive Conference Room 1. A voice announced through the intercom. Richard pressed the response button. "Come in." Seconds later, the magnetic locks released with a heavy metallic click before locking again as Security Chief Daniel Ross stepped inside, carrying a black evidence case. His usually calm expression had vanished. He looked directly at Richard before speaking. "Sir, we have confirmed someone entered the executive pantry during the 52-second window Miss Williams described." Every executive stared at Maya. Daniel continued. "The hallway camera covering that entrance stopped recording for exactly 49 seconds. It was not a malfunction. Someone disabled it manually." Ethan's confident expression faded for the first time that morning. Richard slowly turned toward Maya once more. She had not raised her voice, demanded recognition, or defended herself. She had simply trusted what everyone else had overlooked. And for the first time, every person seated around that table realized the quietest employee in the building might also be the only witness who had truly been paying attention. Daniel Ross carefully placed the black evidence case on the conference table before opening it with practiced precision. Inside rested a sealed evidence bag containing the untouched porcelain cup, a pair of disposable gloves, and several printed photographs from the executive hallway. Every executive leaned forward, their earlier confidence replaced by uneasy curiosity. Richard Harrison remained standing, his attention fixed on the photographs while Maya quietly stepped back beside her service card, unsure whether she still belonged in the room. Daniel spread the images across the polished wood. The first showed the empty hallway outside the executive pantry at exactly 9:23 that morning. The second captured the same hallway less than a minute later. The third was nothing but static before the recording abruptly ended. "Someone interrupted the camera feed," Daniel explained. "Our cybersecurity team confirmed it was disabled locally, not through the network." Ethan Brooks immediately shook his head. "That proves nothing. Cameras fail. Systems fail. We are wasting valuable time because of coincidence." Daniel looked directly at him. "Our surveillance equipment has battery backup and redundant recording. It does not simply fail for 49 seconds. The room became silent again. Richard slowly picked up one photograph. Who had authorized access to the executive pantry during that minute? Daniel opened a digital tablet and reviewed the access records. Only 4 people used badge access this morning. The catering supervisor, Miss Williams, your executive assistant, and executive director Ethan Brooks. No one spoke. Ethan answered almost immediately. "Of course I entered the pantry. I approved breakfast service before the meeting. That is completely routine." Richard nodded once. "It is." Ethan relaxed slightly before continuing. "This entire situation is turning into an investigation built around assumptions from someone whose job is cleaning coffee stains." The words hung heavily in the air. Several executives shifted uncomfortably but said nothing. Maya lowered her eyes for a brief moment. She had heard similar remarks before. Different buildings, different employers, different people. The message was always the same. Someone wearing her uniform could clean the room, but could never possibly understand what happened inside it. Richard noticed the expression on Maya's face, not anger, not embarrassment, simply quiet disappointment. Before he could respond, Daniel removed another item from the evidence case. It was a folded inventory sheet from the executive pantry. "There is one more detail," he said. "Miss Williams reported replacing a full box of porcelain stirring spoons at 9:15. When my team inspected the pantry, one spoon was missing." Ethan gave a small laugh. "Now we are counting spoons." Daniel remained perfectly composed. "Normally we would not. However, laboratory protocol requires collecting every item that may have contacted food or beverages." Richard slowly set the photograph back onto the table. "Send everything to an independent laboratory," he said. "The cup, the remaining coffee, the spoon, every container from the pantry." Daniel nodded. "The courier has already left." Ethan's composure cracked ever so slightly. Without consulting legal, Richard looked directly at him. "When there is uncertainty involving executive safety, I do not wait for committee approval." Another long silence settled over the room. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, gray clouds drifted across the Charlotte skyline, softening the morning sunlight until the glass towers reflected little more than shadows. Maya quietly watched the changing light spill across the untouched coffee cup. She had no idea what the laboratory would find. She only knew that something had been wrong the moment she smelled that unfamiliar aroma. Richard followed her gaze before speaking in a calm voice that carried through the room. Until the laboratory reports are complete, no one leaves this floor without Security Chief Ross's authorization. As those words settled over the executives, everyone realized the meeting had changed completely. It was no longer about profits, investors, or quarterly projections. It had become a search for the truth, and the person everyone had dismissed first had become the most important witness in the building. The next 40 minutes passed with a silence that felt heavier than any argument could have. The executive boardroom, usually filled with confident voices and polished presentations, had become a place where every quiet sound seemed unusually loud. The antique clock continued its steady rhythm against the walnut wall. The heating system released a soft breath through hidden vents. Beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, a light rain began drifting across the Charlotte skyline, turning distant office towers into blurred reflections beneath a blanket of gray clouds. No one reached for the untouched breakfast pastries. No one poured another cup of coffee. Even the executives who normally checked their phones every few seconds simply stared at the conference table, waiting for answers that refused to arrive quickly. Maya remained beside her service card, her hands folded gently in front of her apron. She had spent years learning that patience often revealed more than arguments ever could. There was nothing left for her to explain. She had already shared everything she knew. Now the truth belonged to facts instead of opinions. Richard Harrison slowly walked toward the windows, stopping with his hands behind his back as he watched raindrops race down the glass. He remembered countless mornings when he had entered the building without noticing the employees quietly preparing it before sunrise. Housekeepers, maintenance workers, cafeteria staff, security officers. They were always present, yet somehow invisible. He wondered how many important details he had missed over the years simply because he had never thought to ask the people who observed everything while expecting nothing in return. Across the room, Ethan Brooks sat unusually still. His fingers rested on the conference table, tapping almost imperceptibly before stopping each time he noticed someone looking his way. He attempted to review financial reports on his tablet, but his attention wandered toward the sealed evidence bag every few moments. Daniel Ross noticed the pattern without saying a word. Experience had taught him that pressure often revealed more than questioning. Every person responded differently while waiting. Some became restless. Others became unusually quiet. Daniel simply watched. Maya lowered her eyes toward the polished marble floor reflecting the muted daylight spilling through the windows. She thought about her grandmother sitting at home, probably believing this morning looked exactly like every other workday. She smiled faintly to herself. Her grandmother always said that doing the right thing rarely felt comfortable in the moment. Courage was not the absence of fear. It was choosing honesty while fear stood beside you. Maya finally understood what those words truly meant. Richard turned away from the windows and looked toward her once again. This time he noticed details he had overlooked before. The careful stitching repairing the cuff of her housekeeping sleeve. The comfortable shoes worn from long hours of walking polished hallways. The small notebook tucked into the pocket of her cleaning cart, its edges softened from frequent use. None of those details belonged to someone careless. They belonged to someone who valued precision. Someone who respected work whether anyone noticed or not. Outside the conference room, hurried footsteps echoed briefly before fading again. Daniel's security radio crackled with a low voice that only he could hear. He listened without interrupting anyone before quietly acknowledging the message. His expression changed almost imperceptibly. Richard recognized it immediately. After years of negotiating billion-dollar contracts, he had learned to read the smallest changes in people's faces. Something had happened. Daniel looked toward Richard, then briefly toward Maya, before speaking in the calm, measured voice that every person in the room had been waiting to hear. "Sir," he said, "the independent laboratory has completed its preliminary analysis. They are transmitting the first results now." Daniel Ross placed his tablet in the center of the conference table, the illuminated laboratory report reflecting across the polished wood. Every eye followed the screen as though the next sentence might permanently change every career in the room. Richard Harrison read the opening paragraph without speaking. His expression remained composed, but the muscles along his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Finally, he looked up. The laboratory confirmed an unauthorized chemical compound inside the coffee sample. he said quietly. No one moved. The silence that followed seemed almost unreal. The report continued by explaining that the substance did not belong in any beverage prepared by the executive kitchen and had been introduced after the original coffee was brewed. Daniel carefully turned the tablet so the board members could verify the findings themselves. Several executives leaned closer, reading each line twice before slowly leaning back into their chairs. Ethan Brooks attempted a polite smile. Well, whoever entered the pantry clearly intended to create confusion. Fortunately, Miss Williams noticed something unusual before anyone drank it. Richard did not respond immediately. Instead, he continued reading the remaining pages. His eyes stopped on a section highlighted by the laboratory investigators. Chief Ross, he asked calmly, what does this note refer to? Daniel stepped forward. The laboratory recovered partial fingerprints from the porcelain handle and from the missing stirring spoon that was found inside the executive pantry trash container. Ethan answered before anyone else could speak. That proves nothing. Half the executives handled coffee service this morning. Daniel slowly shook his head. No, sir. According to housekeeping procedures, each executive receives an individually prepared cup. Miss Williams confirmed that Mr. Harrison's porcelain cup remained untouched after preparation until someone entered the pantry during the surveillance blackout. Richard looked toward Maya. Is that accurate? She nodded without hesitation. Yes, sir. I placed your cup on the silver tray and left immediately for fresh linen napkins. No one else should have touched it. Daniel opened another page. Security also reviewed electronic access records more closely. While 4 employees entered the pantry this morning, only one access badge remained inside for longer than 40 seconds during the camera interruption. Every executive instinctively looked toward Ethan Brooks. For the first time that morning, he did not meet anyone's eyes. Instead, he reached for a glass of water before realizing his hand was trembling slightly. He quickly placed the glass back onto the table. You cannot possibly believe this is enough evidence to accuse me, he said, forcing a calm tone that no longer sounded natural. Richard remained remarkably composed. I am accusing no one. He gently closed the tablet. I am following facts. Daniel continued. There is one additional discovery. During our inspection of the executive pantry, maintenance recovered a miniature signal jammer hidden beneath the lower storage cabinet. It temporarily disrupted the hallway camera while leaving the rest of the security system operational. Purchasing records show that identical equipment was approved last month for a demonstration requested by Strategic Operations. The room became absolutely still. Strategic Operations was Ethan Brooks's department. Ethan immediately looked around the table. Many people had access to that equipment. Daniel nodded. That is true. However, building access logs show only one person checked it out yesterday afternoon and never returned it. Richard slowly folded his hands together. Who? Daniel answered without raising his voice. Executive Director Ethan Brooks. Nobody spoke. Rain continued sliding down the windows while the city beyond the glass carried on as though nothing extraordinary had happened. Inside the boardroom, however, the balance of power had shifted completely. Maya Williams had not exposed anyone through anger or accusation. She had simply trusted her careful observations when everyone else dismissed them. Richard turned toward her, his expression no longer distant but deeply reflective. For the first time since entering Harrison Global 6 months earlier, Maya was not standing in the room because she cleaned it. She was standing there because she had seen the truth before anyone else. No one spoke after Daniel Ross finished. The weight of the evidence settled over the boardroom more heavily than the rain clouds hanging above the Charlotte skyline. Ethan Brooks slowly leaned back in his chair, staring at the polished conference table instead of the faces surrounding him. Years of carefully built confidence seemed to disappear in a matter of seconds. Richard Harrison remained silent for a long moment before quietly sliding the laboratory report across the table toward Daniel. Chief Ross, he said with steady composure, our legal department and law enforcement will handle everything from this point forward. Please escort Mr. Brooks to a private conference room where he may wait with counsel present. Daniel nodded respectfully. Yes, sir. Ethan looked as though he wanted to argue, but the facts resting on the conference table left very little room for explanation. Without another word, he slowly stood, straightened his jacket one final time, and walked toward the conference room doors accompanied by Daniel Ross. As the doors closed behind them, an unfamiliar silence settled over the executives who remained. For the first time in years, titles and corner offices offered no protection from truth. Richard turned away from the doors and looked directly at Maya Williams. She instinctively took half a step backward, assuming she should quietly leave now that the immediate crisis had passed. That was what she had always done. Finish the work. Stay unnoticed. Let others return to their important conversations. Miss Williams, Richard said. She stopped immediately. Would you please stay for a moment? Every executive watched as Maya slowly turned back toward the table. Richard walked around the end of the conference table until only a few feet separated them. For a brief moment, he simply studied the woman whose name he had never bothered to learn before that morning. He thought about every time he had walked past housekeeping staff without making eye contact. Every quiet employee whose careful work allowed his company to function while receiving almost none of the recognition. He drew a slow breath. I owe you an apology. The words surprised everyone in the room. Billionaires rarely apologized in front of their executive boards. Richard continued before anyone could interrupt. This morning, I looked at your uniform before I listened to your voice. I allowed position to influence judgment, and that was my mistake. Maya blinked in quiet surprise. She had expected questions, perhaps even thanks, but not this. Richard extended his hand with genuine respect. You did not save my reputation today. You may very well have saved my life. But even more importantly, you protected the integrity of this company by choosing honesty when remaining silent would have been easier. Maya accepted the handshake with both humility and dignity. I was only doing what I believed was right, sir. Richard smiled gently. That is exactly why it matters. Several executives lowered their eyes, remembering their own reactions only an hour earlier. They had laughed, doubted, and dismissed the quiet woman standing beside a housekeeping cart simply because they believed important ideas could only come from important titles. Richard turned toward the board members. Effective immediately, I want an employee advisory council created. It will include representatives from every department in this company, including housekeeping, maintenance, cafeteria services, security, and facilities. Every voice deserves to be heard before problems become crises. A few executives nodded slowly, recognizing the lesson without needing it explained. Maya looked around the room with quiet gratitude. She did not ask for a promotion, a reward, or public recognition. Knowing that someone had finally understood the value of listening was more meaningful than anything money could provide. As sunlight slowly pushed through the retreating rain clouds outside, soft reflections filled the conference room, and for the first time that morning, the building no longer felt divided by status. It felt united by truth. The following Monday morning, Harrison Global looked exactly as it always had from the outside. The sunrise painted the glass tower with soft shades of gold, commuters filled the sidewalks carrying paper coffee cups, and the revolving doors welcomed another busy week into the heart of downtown Charlotte. Yet inside the building, something impossible to measure had quietly changed. Maya Williams arrived before 6 o'clock, just as she always had. She entered through the employee entrance carrying the same worn canvas lunch bag, tied back her curls, pinned on the same silver name badge, and gently placed her hands on the familiar gray housekeeping cart. She had not asked for a different office, a larger paycheck, or a title that sounded more impressive. Her work remained the same because her character had never depended on recognition. As she rolled her cart into the executive hallway, something unexpected happened. The first person she passed, a senior accountant who had worked in the building for nearly 12 years, stopped walking. "Good morning, Miss Williams," he said with a warm smile. Maya smiled back, surprised by the simple greeting. A few steps later, another employee held the elevator door open instead of allowing it to close. On the 43rd floor, an executive assistant who had barely acknowledged her before thanked her for preparing the conference rooms each morning. None of those moments were dramatic. None would ever appear in a newspaper. Yet together they carried more meaning than applause ever could. Respect had quietly replaced indifference. When Maya reached the executive conference room, she noticed one small change waiting beside the entrance. The silver plaque listing emergency procedures had been updated over the weekend. Beneath the company values of integrity, excellence, and accountability, a new line had been carefully engraved. Every voice matters. Maya stood still for a moment, reading the words before quietly beginning her work. She polished the conference table until the morning sunlight reflected across its surface like calm water. She straightened each chair with the same careful precision she had always shown. Nothing about her routine had changed, but everything about the way people saw it had. A few minutes later, Richard Harrison stepped out of the elevator carrying a simple travel mug instead of his usual porcelain cup. He paused when he saw Maya arranging fresh notepads around the conference table. "Good morning, Maya," he said. "Not Miss Williams. Not housekeeping. Just Maya." She looked up with a gentle smile. "Good morning, Mr. Harrison." Richard glanced around the spotless room before quietly saying, "I have spent years believing leadership meant having the right answers. You reminded me that real leadership begins with listening to the people everyone else overlooks." Maya lowered her eyes modestly. "My grandmother always told me that people reveal who they are by the way they treat someone who cannot offer them anything in return." Richard smiled thoughtfully. "She sounds like a remarkable woman." "She is," Maya replied softly. Richard nodded once before walking into the boardroom, leaving the door open behind him instead of closing it. Maya watched the sunlight spill across the polished floor as the city slowly came alive beyond the towering windows. The hallway remained peaceful except for the quiet sound of wheels rolling across marble and distant conversations beginning another ordinary workday. Sometimes justice did not arrive with loud celebrations or grand speeches. Sometimes it arrived in the form of a sincere apology, an open door, a spoken name, and a simple act of respect that should have existed all along. Maya gently pushed her housekeeping cart forward, disappearing down the bright hallway with the same quiet grace she had carried from the beginning, no longer invisible, not because she had changed, but because everyone else finally had.